Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the tax extenders legislation that we have before us and the real consequences of our fiscal recklessness. I cannot stress enough that our spending is completely out of control, and it seems like every week this body passes more legislation and spends more money and adds more debt onto the backs of our children. And unfortunately, the Democrat majority continues to sing from the same old sheet of music. More debt, more spending, and more fiscal recklessness. Last week, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office provided their analysis of President Obama's budget, and it is nothing short of a fiscal train wreck and a roadmap to banana republic status. It truly pains me to stand on the floor of the United States Senate and tell the American people that President Obama is leading us down a path of bankruptcy. I believe that this budget is simply reckless, with enormous budget deficits as far as the eye can see. Just this year, the government has overspent by over $1 trillion. The same thing last year. We're adding trillions of dollars in debt to our children and our grandchildren. Nevadans and people across the country are facing very hard economic times, and for the federal government to be spending this much money is really an insult to American families everywhere. In 2020, the last year of the president's budget, our nation's credit card bill will account for 90% of the economy. But what does this mean in terms that real people can understand? Because these numbers are so large and so enormous, it's difficult to put them in perspective. So let me talk in terms of consequences, the consequences of this fiscal recklessness. At a certain point, foreign countries will not buy our IOUs, our bonds, or they will demand higher interest rates because they're riskier. Our standard of living will decrease. Actually, for the first time in American history, future generations will be worse off than prior generations. The American dream of owning a home as a young adult will vanish. You'll have to wait into your 40s and 50s to be able to buy a home. Families, in order to maintain a similar standard of living, will have to become smaller. With a less dynamic economy, we will enjoy less of the fruits of innovation and technological progress. I know that this is hard to hear, but one day, if we continue down the current path, this scenario will become a reality. We cannot keep spending and spending and spending without consequence. Democrats claim that we need to spend money because our economy is sluggish. We need stimulus after stimulus to put us back on the right track. Well, I can tell you we are not on the right track. Unemployment in my state is still 13%, and there really isn't much light on the horizon. We've lost our way and have wandered down a path of fiscal crisis. More spending doesn't fix the economic crisis. I want to talk about the Depression of 1920 to 21 that you never heard about. It was an extremely sharp recession. Shortly after the end of World War I, we went into this economic crisis. The Department of Commerce estimates the economy declined by nearly 7% during this time period. Unemployment rose sharply during the recession. Estimates put the increase in the rate of unemployment went from around 5% to almost 12%. From May of 1920 to July of 1921, automobile production declined by 60%, and total industrial production across the United States decreased by 30%. Stocks also fell dramatically. The Dow Jones Industrials was cut by almost half. Business failures tripled between 1919 and 1922. But instead of a fiscal stimulus, here's what President Harding did. He cut the government's budget nearly in half between 1920 and 1922. Marginal tax rates were slashed across all income groups. So he cut taxes and cut government spending at the same time. This encouraged businesses to grow and to add jobs in the private sector. The national debt was reduced by 1/3. In 1920 acceptance speech for the Republican nomination, Harding said, "We will attempt intelligent and courageous deflation, strike at government borrowing which enlarges the evil, and we will attack the high cost of government with every energy and facility which attend Republican capacity. We promise that relief which will attend the halting of waste and extravagance and the renewal of practice of public economy, not alone because it will relieve tax burdens, but because it will be an example to stimulate thrift and economy in private life." You see, Harding's laissez-faire economic policies, rapid government downsizing, and low tax rates spurred a private market recovery and led to a readjustment and investment and consumption for a peacetime economy. Unemployment rate went from almost 12% in a little over a year to less than 2%. Let me repeat that. Unemployment rate went from almost 12% to under 2%. I don't think that's what's happening today. This episode in history provides a counterexample to the argument that we need massive government spending to stimulate our nation's economy. You see, we don't hear about the Great Depression of 1920. Instead, we hear about the Roaring '20s because sound fiscal policy, cutting tax rates, cutting spending, led to economic resurgence. This is an example that shows when the burden of government is lessened through less spending, less taxes, and less debt, the private sector will respond with investment, job creations, which lead to economic growth. So why is the legislation on the floor today not the answer? If creating jobs is priority number one, and it should be for this body, why is the majority party letting tax incentives for job-creating businesses expire? These non-controversial provisions expired 3 months ago. Why is helping business an afterthought for the majority? The tax extender portion of this bill could have passed by unanimous consent months ago, but the majority just didn't want to bother with that. It will have to be extended again later this year because the provisions will again expire on December 31st. This is not the right policy for creating a stable and certain environment for employers who are wanting to hire more employees. The tax extender provisions of the bill amount to only $25 billion of this massive $144 billion bill. The tax extenders are good. They include energy production credits, research credits, accelerated depreciation for certain businesses, state and local sales tax deductions, and low-income housing tax credits. Now, I've said that these are good provisions, but we should have done much more. Foremost, we should be cutting individual and corporate income tax rates so people and businesses could use their money to get the economy moving again and could invest in job creation and wealth-creating enterprises. But at the same time, we need to cut government spending so we aren't massively increasing the debt. You see, I hate to break it to you, but America is falling behind other countries in that regard. Tax relief is wrongly criticized by those across the aisle. They have been arguing for job creation, but their policies are making it tougher on private businesses. In order to help these businesses find a stable footing once again, we need to make permanent tax relief and not wait for these extensions to expire again and again. So let me conclude. To get this economy moving, we don't need to pass a bill that's going to add over $100 billion to our deficit and our debt. That's what the bill before us does today. Adds over $100 billion to our deficit and our debt. A few years ago, $100 billion was a lot of money around this place. We throw that amount like it's nothing around here anymore. That is debt that is adding to the coming fiscal crisis that this country is going to be facing. I believe that the prescription to get this economy going is to cut taxes, cut government spending, believe in the spirit of the American people and the American entrepreneurs, instead of creating jobs here in Washington, D.C. I don't know if American people know that over 100,000 jobs were created in this city last year. Over 100,000 jobs in Washington, D.C. That's about as many jobs as my state lost. That's not the prescription for economic prosperity. Government jobs have to be sustained with tax dollars year after year. When the private sector creates those jobs, the whole economy grows and feeds off itself, and you don't need taxpayer dollars to continue to subsidize those jobs. As a matter of fact, they feed in money to the federal treasury. So, Mr. President, the bill before us today, I think, is fiscally irresponsible. It's the exact opposite direction that we should be going, and what we should be doing is acting in accord as Americans, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but let's look at history and learn from it and get this economy going by focusing on actually what has worked in the past and what will work in the future. Mr. President, I yield the floor.